with you here
in this studio.
Yeah, they've been here about 2 or 3 years, and
That's
this
right.
is access cable television, you know.
Yep.
So it's got a unique niche in terms of the communications of the world, and I think it's a particularly important one where, you know, there's going to be a chance for some creative things to happen that are a little bit distant from the established way. So maybe we can talk some things alternatively on this program.
We'll have a go at it.
Yeah, we can. It's an amazing time, what with all the bombing and that sort of thing that's been going on. Yeah, welcome very much to Conversations. This being September 26, the year 2001. So that's 15 days on from the horrendous bombing that took place at the World Trade Center on the 11th of September. And in view of the fact that all citizens seem to be trying in their own varying ways to try and do whatever they can to address the situation coming off that bombing, some see it in existentially challenging terms to the whole human species, as it were. Others see it in more traditional warlike kind of postures and so forth. But in the fact that we would like to try and contribute to that, we're very pleased to be able to welcome to the program tonight a gentleman who can speak to a movement of understanding in the economic realm that is perhaps in a very real sense a qualitatively new look at things that might come out of the situation that we're in, that being the movement and the understanding of economics called binary economics. He's the co-author of the book Binary Economics, The New Paradigm, just in from London. And Rodney Shakespeare, welcome very, very much to Conversations and to New York City and to the Manhattan Network studios once again.
It's nice to be back again, Harold. Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to want to talk about things in a large tableau if we can, and particularly on the economic consequences. But all the world now is concentrated and seized by the fact that we've had this this incredible shift in terms of consciousness coming out of the bombing of the World Trade Center on the 11th of September. I wonder, you've just come in the last day or so from London. I wonder maybe you could share a little bit for the viewers your reaction, perhaps where you were, how it happened, and then perhaps give us a reading of the British reaction to the bombing, and maybe that can be a key point for us to talk about and get into some of these other questions about where do we go from here. But could you share a little of the British reaction?
I was in London at the time, and there was undoubtedly a shock and a feeling of wanting to do something, and of course a complete inability to do that. And then it may seem a strange word, but there was, I think, an expression of delight when, at the changing of the guard ceremony, the American national anthem was played, and people were smiling, and I felt at least a message got across to the Atlantic of sympathy and understanding in a disgraceful, very trying situation.
Yeah, there seems to be
abominable carnage.
As the speech that President Bush gave, and he had, you know, the Prime Minister was here, and he said there was a special British relationship that goes back between Britain and the United States. That does go back a long time, and there is a special relationship between the two
It
countries.
goes back a long time, but in my youth there was the war and the American help, which we're eternally grateful for.
Yeah, that's right. And we can remember, we're saying you were a bit young. You were just in the cradle, more or less, as it were. But it's easy. It might be good for some Londoners and some of the England people of England and Britain who had the Blitz of London. There was a Blitz when there was a real bombing that was you know, suffered, the Coventry and that sort of thing. They had that.
I saw the whole of East End of London burning.
You did indeed.
Oh yes.
But as it would have been an infant, it would have been a long time ago.
I was an infant then, but then for the B1 and the B2, I was in London and saw all that.
So that's there. Now we've never experienced this in the United States. I mean, we had the Civil War. We had some things in the War of 1812 and so forth. But this thing that happened to America really has shaken its sense of isolation that has been held by many. There's an isolationist trend that we can stand alone.
We had Pearl Harbor.
We had Pearl Harbor in the Second World War that was off-continent, that sort of thing. But we've not had that directly here. So many of the areas of Europe, for instance, or other parts of the world have suffered this.
The UK has not been occupied.
Yeah.
For many centuries.
Well, we've not been occupied yet, but we've been bombed, as it were. You were bombed by the Nazi, and we were bombed by forces like that. So it's really shaken this country. I wonder if there's some lessons to be learned from the British resolve and the British experience that we could learn from that. From the Second War, I mean.
Yes. And there's a straight, simple reaction. There's an obviously determination to do something. The real problem is whether you go in terms of military, keep it in a military area where the response may very be inaccurate and may not well succeed. And I do think that there has to be an addressing of the economic issues, those issues which give strength to young men who, a bit hot-headed maybe, want to go in and fight for a cause. And you have to draw the teeth of that cause, because if you don't, you're into something which is immensely dangerous.
Now, the young men you're talking about are, in this case?
Well, I am fairly certain that there'll be someone, even where the area, even where I live, there are young people who come from a Islamic background,
yes,
who do feel a little bit isolated, who may not necessarily be able to get work easily. And if you put these factors together and then give them a cause, they can be easy meat for extremists in some of the schools, and may go off and fight for a cause, because young men do like to fight for causes. My own feeling is that in the situation we're in, we do have to address the issues that we can address, and the major one is economics, and there are levels of poverty in the world. 20% of the world exists on under $1 a day.
50% under $2 a day.
And I think it's 50, well, it's 50% and it's 55 under $3 a day. Now, that is the most extraordinary thing. All the rhetoric and propaganda says, well, the whole thing is being solved, but it was capable of being solved, Harold, in terms of productive capacity. We can solve the poverty in any country throughout the world. But the structures that we have at the moment do not allow that to happen.
Well, that's just quite, and not only the structures in the minds, and we might as well get into this in a certain sense, as much as we could be talking about directly off the bottom, but get into this, that Maurice Strong, among others at the UN, have been here and we've talked, and they say it's not only the existing statistics. We've got 400 individuals, the wealth of 400 individuals represents the wealth of half the population of the world in terms of that. But it's not necessarily the static statistics that we see, but it's the trendings. And the trendings of the system that we have in place, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the view of how economics are going to evolve on this planet and so forth, are not trending in a direction that is going to be able to be seen in the eyes of a great number of people. More than about 20% of the world population, the elites around the world, are doing very well, but there's something like 80% of the world population that are not doing well, and the trends in terms of their lot in life, as it were, are not seen to be able to be alleviated within the context that's being projected. So that's a ready-made situation for frustration at the minimum, and I mean it's just a thing to be addressed.
Are adverse, and you're quite right about the huge concentrations of wealth. It's an aspect which people like Jeff Gates rightly concentrate on. But given that the potential, the actual material potential to solve the thing at the moment, you have to look at the structures and say just why it hasn't happened. And the existing paradigm says, well, if you're not rich, if you have poverty, basically it's your fault. It also says is that labour, if you do any labour that you do, will suffice to give you a reasonable income, to give you dignity, and to do this and that. It completely ignores the fact that most labour does not do this, and that people may not be able to get jobs. Maybe carers. And even if they do get jobs, those jobs won't necessarily pay much as those figures we gave just now. Well,
back on this thing, we're going to get to that thing. We've got a lot of time. We've got a couple hours where we can talk about the things. We want to get into the binary economics view, which is unique and very, very important and so forth. But I went back to that British thing. Is you were bombed by the Germans who came over from the continent and so forth. But the Britons had, and now all the world's going to be focusing on, well, to a large degree, Afghanistan, Pakistan, even the subcontinent, India, that area, where Britain had an imperial role for a long time, and there was, I've been talking to some of my Pakistani friends, and that they were there, and they withdrew after the Second World War. The Western expansion into that part of the world withdrew largely under the activity of Mr. Gandhi and a non-violent kind of strategic choice in terms of how to address the British power. They withdrew from there, but now we've been attacked with a violent response from that part of the world, as it were, the Islamic part of the world, and it seems to speak for a mass defection from the established way among many of the people of the Islamic world, mass defection and a sense of alienation from the structures by which the world system is being operated in terms of, or at least they claim the possibility of what they call Islamic-wide jihad against the West. Is this something that from the British tradition, having had an imperial outreach from Europe and so forth, has something that's traditionally been part of the geopolitical thinking of Halford Mackinder and some of these other people from your longer experience of
the British
global reach, as it were?
The British were in India, and they went to the northwest, and
Kandahar?
Kandahar, and they were basically to control the hill tribes and to stop the Russians coming through to warm water access. And with the British activities up there were some disastrous military campaigns because the Afghans are tremendous fighters on their own soil.
Yeah, they suffered. They had some. I had a relative that was a general officer up at Kandahar in the northwest province back in the 19th century. So, I mean, Britain's had a long experience.
A long experience.
You understand what I'm trying to say?
And they've been in that part of the world. And then with the partition, after the Second World War, it was done. There were huge movements of populations, and there was millions.
Awful displacement. Millions, yeah, slaughtered and displaced, yeah.
As the empire withdrew, which suppressed a lot of the tensions between the groupings, so the populations, the Hindus generally moved to the south, and the Muslims moved more into the Pakistan area, leaving many groups being both. But there was one area, which was Kashmir, where I think it was the Nizam, or the ruler of the land, took his own decision, as he was allowed to by the negotiations, to go in with India, and that state is substantially Islamic.
Yeah, it's 98%, I think.
Core of the tragedy, and it's a beautiful land.
You have actually been there?
I've not been there. I want to go there.
No, I've wanted to go there. It's gorgeous.
I think it's most unlikely that I ever will.
And it's one of the real hot spots in the world. And in fact, of this Islamic view of the world, some people are saying we're facing an Islamic challenge. If there could be a Islamic-wide jihad that could destabilize the governments in Saudi Arabia and other places, that it could be a real conflagration that could develop. But two of the areas where there's a real border, I mean, there's real land dispute and so forth, is Palestine, obviously, and the Israeli situation has been there. We're very aware of that. But the other one is Kashmir, and there's been a long-running, very, very serious feud between India, which has been from the standpoint of the Pakistani Muslims, an occupying force with an army, sometimes as much as 600,000 in the Vale of Kashmir, and that many of those freedom fighters, or those mujahideen from Afghanistan, have been fighting in what is called the freedom fighter battle for the liberation of Kashmir. And both those two powers just recently have become atomic powers, so this is part of the geopolitical reality, no? And that used to be British territory.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Well, that is dangerous in itself. But on the jihad part, the Islamic world, like other parts of the world, is very, very, very diverse.
Yeah, surely.
But the danger is that you don't do certain things and, in effect, allow things to coalesce into a jihad.
We've never had that. A Islamic-wide jihad from Indonesia to Algeria or Mauritania is what is threatened. We have Islamic fundamentalist forces in Algeria, very powerful, in Egypt. But that's what some people are worried about, that there would be a general avalanche toward that, and that in terms of our coming with such overwhelming power, or something that we think we might be able to exert, that there could be a danger of 1.2 billion people there.
One of the problems is that, as far as I know, all the Islamic states do not have particularly democratic structures, and some of them are heavily autocratic and very often plutocratic with these extremes. And as a result, there are great tensions within these societies. Now, at the moment, we cannot directly do anything to do that. I mean, it would be extremely dangerous to interfere and to attempt to modify the Arab states one way or another. But what you've got to do is to provide some sort of ideas and some sort of thinking which can have great appeal to the mass of the Islamic populations, as indeed of any of the other populations throughout the world. If you don't do that, then the things could coalesce into a great big jihad, which was the aim, of course, of people like Saddam Hussein, not liked at all, despised and detested by most of the Arab world. But there are then great sections for which he would be a leader.
Oh yes,
partly against some of their own structures.
Not only that, and we've been talking, and they've been saying that they want to try it. Some people were shocked. I mean, absolutely the whole world has been shocked by the fact that the United States, the superpower, had been so vulnerable to such an attack by relatively, by box knives. They were able to do such a thing. They were shocked by that. And one of the questions they would say is, how could it be that people would, in a certain sense, hate us, which we think of as being a liberal bastion of progressive development in the world, so much they can't understand how that could possibly be. And but then I don't think it behooves us to be thinking, as seems to be the notion now in the world, that the reason they, let's say the Islamicists, and I would submit there are others, there have been demonstrations in Genoa by people that are opposed to, that there are many people who are worried or in opposition in a fundamental way to the way things are, as it were, that the traditional powers seem to say, well, what is in place is fine and suitable to the way we're moving. That's a status quo kind of position. But there's more than just the Islamicists who take that view. And it seems not to be appropriate to me for our powers to say the reason they hate us is because we represent everything light, everything good and trust and truthful in the world, that is the West, and that's why they hate us, because they represent everything black. It's a tendency toward a propagandistic thing that's going to have to be fought against in a certain sense in order to get at something like the truth
that's the sort
of what actually does motivate those people.
Well, exactly. That's the sort of rhetoric which was very strong in the years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where you had people like Francis Fukuyama doing the end of history, and basically saying that what is in the West is perfection made manifest, and that it's a science, it's just alleged, and that everybody gets their just desserts, and it's evolution at the end of history. History has finally perfected itself. Extraordinary arrogance. How that danger still seems to be there now, that type of thinking. I was told this morning there's been a change, I believe, in the name of the campaign which is coming together. And it was Operation Enduring...
I think it was Infinite Justice. Infinite Justice they were going to use, and now they're using some sort of endearing something. Or
enduring freedom.
I don't know, something like that.
The word freedom is part of the rhetoric of free market capitalism. And everybody naturally in there, think the word freedom means liberty. But if you actually then go behind the rhetoric and say, how much liberty do people have who do not have a secure way of earning a decent living? And I think that they're going for rhetoric which is not actually is being based upon the assumption that what they stand for is something which is unchallengeable and that there cannot be anything better. I think that's very, very dangerous. I can understand that in military terms that they feel they have to do something, but in terms of the thinking, to stand up and say, well, like the World Bank was dismissing the globalization protesters, saying they have no case, they don't know what they're up to, there are a lot of anarchists and troublemakers. And I have to say that the conventional television networks and the conventional press was very largely taking the same line.
Oh yes, they have, I think, by and large. And more or less that line is to those, I don't know what the percentage is, maybe 20% of the world population, including Western Europe and the United States, and then the elites of the various countries around the world. Things are going very, very well for the vast majority of those 20%. But for the world population and for seeing the whole population, again, back to a man as prestigious as Maurice Strong, saying that the trends in terms of economic justice and so forth are very, very disturbing, and that we do not have a system in place represented by the World Bank, the IMF, and so forth that is protested by the protesters who are going to go to Washington on the 29th. I understand there's more people are going to be going to Washington to protest in general, operation, that we're involved in, the military we're involved in, but that there's something new needed, and that impetus towards something new is something that could be really snuffed out, as it were, in terms of a patriotic patriotic attack than any kind of a dissension toward the absolute and truth that we are rightfully representing in this universe. I mean, that's the sort of view that you've got to be guarded against.
When you get something so large-scale and sudden as those attacks on New York and Washington, a society is bound to close down on any form of dissension. I mean, there are practical matters of tracing information, etc., etc., and these are going to alter the liberties. But on the intellectual level, you've seen that the globalization protesters have effectively changed the nature of the protest and are going more for emphasizing peace. But the intellectual attack has come to a dead stop at the moment. And I think that at this moment, if ever there was a need now to open up the intellectual debate, it is now, and it should be done by the people who thought of as globalization protesters.
Well, perhaps it should be, because some people say that it ushers in a moment of existential, really, concern with the whole of the human condition, because we've reached a point now, and it's on everyone's lips now as we talk on September 26th, that there's a realization, and I've said on another program with others, that Joshua Lederberg and others who really understand these things see that with bacteriological and chemical weaponry that has developed over the 200,000 years of human time on this planet, 10,000 generations, that we have reached a point now where we do have the extended conscious capability that technology is to render the habitat of this earth incapable of the continuation of our species.
Oh, yes.
And that's only been, we've only arrived at that within, we couldn't do it in the Second World War. We couldn't do it at the time of Korea War, the Vietnam War. We couldn't do it then. We couldn't. It's only been within about the last 10 or 15 years that we've crossed that line that the scientists can say that we have this. So there's an existential moment in terms of the evolution of consciousness that would call for some real opening upon out-of-the-envelope thinking, some sort of things that have been taken to be not possible at this particular time as we begin to... That would be the responsibility, particularly of the intellectual community, it would seem to me at this time, under the pressures of, you know, this largely seen evolution of universal consciousness itself.
A crisis, a danger. I think it's, you could say it's about a bigger danger that there's ever been. And it could go to the whole of the human race. At the same time, the other side of it is there is an opportunity if you can take advantage of that opportunity. But the signs are at the moment is just a hardening of attitudes and a refusal to actually think.
Yeah, and so maybe we could start at that. We could think in terms of the fact that we you know, it's an amazing time in which we live in terms of what's going on. My father was born in 1900, and the lifespan of somebody at that time was 48 years. My grandson was just born, and the life expectancy for that child, if we don't get into some sort of an end game here for the species or some sort of thing that could happen within the context which we see, would be 103. I mean, that's a great deal. We have the genome now. We have all these incredible developments of nanotechnology. We have a knowledge base. We have an understanding that's unfolded in this last bloody century that is absolutely phenomenal and ushering in perhaps a qualitative new condition than that which we've been in for 200,000 years.
Take the length of life. When in the UK, the social security, the retirement pension was set up, there was no expectancy. The figures were such that you'd have people living long beyond the age of 65. So if they had a pension, it was something which could be easily accommodated. But the way the figures are going in Japan, for example, soon you will have someone retired and 2 people of working age. And if you do the pension situation by taxing people and redistributing out in pensions, which is the way at the moment, there is a long distance, well, not so long, it's now coming in very rapidly in Japan, and it's going to hit the USA. At the moment there seems to be just a flush of money in their social security, but all that's going to go out of the window. The USA has to come up with a new way of funding its pensions in a situation in which many, many more people are living for longer and longer and actually having shorter and shorter working lives.
Yeah, I know. I think that might be one of many qualitative transformations in terms of the understanding of economics. We have I'm not sure if you're that familiar with the American political scene in the talking classes on television, or there's a fellow, Tip O'Neill, who was a very major figure in the House House of Representatives, and he was a real, you know, he had a saying that he said, all politics, and what we're talking now is geopolitics, and all politics is local. That's a term that has to do with the fact you got to keep that in mind. But it seems to me that in a certain sense, all politics is, in a certain sense, if you look at it, is economic.
Yes.
Because the economics so inform the political process, and the understanding of economics is something that is crucial in terms of trying to understand not only the evolution of politics, but the whole human condition. And if there's something new, as Bobby Dylan used to say, blowing in the wind, in terms of understanding that comes from the arcane field of economic theory, that's something that ought to be given a hearing, perhaps in a way that it hasn't. And perhaps maybe we could address that, because I think this binary notion that you have is something that might be something that offers something different than the traditional pattern in which economics has developed and is accepted by and large by all of our leading political leadership now.
Okay, I'll give a few sentences on the binary economics, and then, if I may, Harold, introduce the subject of how one can open the thinking about this.
All right.
Binary economics, it sounds awful, but binary means composed of two.
That's right.
It just means there are two ways by which wealth is produced. One of them is humans, and the other one is non-humans. You think of a machine. And the humans and the machine, generally speaking, cooperate. And then from that, so there are two ways by which things are produced. Therefore, there are two ways of earning. And therefore, human beings can earn either via their labour, if they're able to labour, and they can earn via the ownership of capital. Now, that second one is excluded for the majority of people by conventional economics. In binary economics, that is the one which comes forward with all massive implications for people, controlled over their, not just their standard of living, not question of whether the economy works efficiently, but questions of their dignity. It has huge implications for women, because in binary economics, you can actually bring in certain individuals, get the new capital ownership. The market mechanisms are not actually attacked or even modified. At the moment, all new productive capital goes into the hands of existing owners.
Well, that is something right there that seems to be the case around the world, isn't it?
It is the case.
We have these. The world is, in some degrees, if I may, we have here we had an election yesterday. We had a primary election. We have an election, so we have a political process where people are able to go to the election and elect representatives to represent them and so forth. We have a degree of political democracy in this country, and in some degrees to the world, and that's one general principle that tends to be wanting to be encouraged as far as the world is concerned. But we have in this country and in the world in general, I think it only can be called, and it's a word, it's a thing that doesn't want to be accepted in a certain sense, we have an economic plutocracy.
You take the
economic ownership of that aspects of production that are not human labor are very, very narrowly held in this country and in all societies around the world. This is an economic plutocracy, this planet.
The politics is that there is a very weak power which individuals may exercise at the local level, but on the national level every 4 years in the United States. But it's very significant, if just take the United States, that only half the electorate, or even less, actually exercise that very weak power.
Well, that's an indication of some alienation, I think, on the
Something
part of a lot.
is going wrong, Harold. Something's going wrong. And but if you then look at what matters in people's lives, is they want a large power which actually operates every minute of the day. And that means whether their spending decisions, whether they have money to spend, and whether they have some control of dignity and control over their lives. Now that is true democracy. And if you had to go for what is the more powerful democracy, the answer is an economic democracy is something much more important for people in their everyday lives, even than a political one, because once people have economic power in their lives, effectively the political consequences do follow. You get the control. But that second one is the one which is just ignored. In fact, Harold, on that, conventional economics says you must not raise any normative issue. And by that means you must never even conceive or think about changing everything. Everything is fine.
Yeah, that's right. That's
come up with a way of changing things, and they say, oh, that's normative.
Yeah,
You're not allowed to even say it or do it.
And I wonder, it's arcane, and that would be in the realm of economic, and it's arcane. It's economic theory,
It's
and you know, and
weird.
it seems
It's
meaningless in terms of the realities of marching armies and that sort of thing. But it really is meaningful. I wonder if maybe we could just tick it off for a minute. And it's in your book, Binary Economics and other things. But if we look at economic theory that informs our political process or our thinking about the private sector and so forth. You can start with Adam Smith, who was the classical, the industrial development began. Ricardo, and then and what we're including in this is a group of thinking. Adam Smith, Ricardo. You could get Karl Marx, 1848, with his notion of the Communist Manifesto. You can get to Lord Keynes, Maynard Keynes, and so informed the Roosevelt and so forth. You can get to Joseph Schumpeter. You can get to Van Hayek. You can get to Friedman, the monetarist, and all the people that inform the political process. So that would be Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, and the world leaders are all into a way of seeing economic theory within a certain context, which is, in a certain sense, is called, it all is based on the labor theory of value.
Well, it was very interesting that in setting out
and
those...
the Marxists said the surplus value theory of labor, and that all wealth and all growth comes from human activity and labor, and the binary paradigm suggests all of those, whether you're a laissez-faire capitalist or a communist or a socialist or whatever you are, or you're a Keynesian or you're a Friedmanite or whatever you are, they're all in the same bag as far as in the same bailiwick in terms of the need for there to be something other than a labor theory of value in terms of economic theory. The only one that seems to be on the horizon, it seems to me, is this notion of binary economics that you and Robert Ashford and Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler sort of pioneered. But there's a distinction between all economic theory and what you're talking about.
When you did that list of names, Howard, you started with Adam Smith.
Yeah.
And the one thing in there which is extraordinarily original is an analysis of how all those people you mentioned and the economics and the politics which come from them, all those people stem from Adam Smith. And who was Adam Smith? Extraordinary person. But Smith was doing his thinking and his analysis of life and events and society.
1776.
That was when it was published. His thinking was being done in the 10 or 15 years before. And the Industrial Revolution was not even underway.
Yeah.
And so when Smith talked about what people today say was a factory, it was not a factory.
Yeah.
It was a manufactory.
Yeah.
That is to say, you had people using hand tools like pliers and tweezers, doing the various processes.
Making pins. Huh?
Making the pins and nails and doing the division of labour. Now, Smith himself seemed to have some sort of feeling for what was going to happen. But he couldn't see into the future.
Yeah.
Yet all our thinking, everyone goes back. You have the free market capitalists. They go back to Smith, but they are going back to a man who did not understand the implications of the Industrial Revolution. And this point was actually taken by Jean-Baptiste Say.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Say has always been sort of sidelined or minimalized as a follower of Adam Smith. And yet, in here,
he's a critic.
we show that he was a critic and that in fact he hit on the key weakness of Smith. He says, how on earth did Smith explain everything in terms of human labour? From that era, Smith has got it wrong.
Yeah.
So here you have Jean-Baptiste Say, because he was writing in 1803 when the Industrial Revolution was already clearly happening.
Right.
It was not clearly happening in 1763, when, which was 40 years when Smith was doing his first thinking.
Yeah, but
that's where the problem lies.
But we have this, I'm wondering when you say the labor theory of value, we have two things that contribute to production. We have labor, and that would include, we have to take it into account, particularly as we come into a cybernetic age with automation coming and so forth. So it's not only just a guy with a wheelbarrow. We talk of labor like labor versus management or something. It's labor in all its human input, from a guy with a wheelbarrow doing physical labor to the most sophisticated intellectual contributions.
It's what you own.
But that's one way in which you can relate by what you, and that would be, for most people, that would be that you are employed, you have a job, you have a labor relationship to production, and that's how you gain an income, and that's how you gain a sense of identity in terms of the world. The other side is everything else other than the human input to production, and that would be technology that is in place, and it's that by and large that technology, or that part of the productive process, is increasingly responsible for production as we move through time, and is increasingly held, and the ownership of which is held by a minuscule few at the top in all the economies of the world, including the United States of America. There's a mismatch.
Yes, and Professor Wolf, who's been on one of your programs, Harold,
Edward Wolf,
I've seen the tape. His figures show that, broadly speaking, that the situation stays like that. Okay, but the point you're hitting on there is that people, there are a lot of jobs around at the moment. But you then look at the length of time that people are actually in education of one form or another, and then you look at the time by which they are going to early retirement, or which they become unemployable. And you are actually, those who are in work very often are overworked and may have 2 or 3 part-time jobs. Those who are actually able to take advantage of jobs, the number is actually probably decreasing as a percentage, particularly in relation to those who are retired. The work years that people actually have to the long span. And we're able to accommodate this because of this increase in the productive capacity, coming certainly from humans, but particularly coming from the non-human things. But what we have to do is to somehow change the way by which people get their income. You can think of it in terms of this is another way by which they get an income. But binary economics prefers to think of it in terms of ensuring that everybody is productive, because we believe that in psychological terms, perhaps one of the deepest impulses in human is that they want to know that they earn their own keep, that they provide enough for their own needs and those of them around.
That seems to be part of all the ethics, Buddhist or whatever ethic, is to guard against what Lewis Kelsey used to call parasitism, or people that are being parasitic on the productive process by not contributing.
People will take money.
And taking without contributing. That's something that seems to be wanting to be avoided in all our ethical systems, in spiritual and ethical and political traditions around the world. It's something universal in that.
Yes, it's self-respect in human beings. But the present system, of course, massively overplays some people for no reason at all, and denies a true productive capacity to most people in the population.
That's right.
And so as a result, everybody gets up to every game underneath the sun to manipulate the whole structure one way or another. But if you open up this question of who or what actually does the work, then you have some sort of hope of getting things rather more honest in the long run.
Perhaps so. And I wonder, maybe we could talk about that. I want to show, maybe we could show, this is a book that I want to show. This is the book. This is a paperback edition of the book that Rodney is the co-author of, along with Mortimer Adler. And here we can, here we got it here now.
Robert Ashford.
Robert Ashford is the co-author of this book along with Rodney. This is recommended. It's Binary Economics, and it's subtitled The New Paradigm. So this is a major work that one would be encouraged to go to try and understand some sort of a new economic understanding. And then I would say that we did a program last week with Brian Becker, who is he's of a Marxist persuasion, as it were, a socialist persuasion, and he recommended to the audience, and he was involved with those that are going to be going to Washington on the 29th of September to protest. They were going to protest the World Bank and International Monetary Fund meeting there. I think that meeting's been canceled, but apparently there's going to be some people going against the flow or the trend of the patriotic notions that are so understandably loose in the country now, to protest the direction that the United States seems to be going. But he was coming at it, and he recommended to one and all that they read the first 2 chapters of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. And I suggested in that the Communist Manifesto will be found in millions of copies and is in the minds of great numbers of people because it was the basis of the Soviet power, that they accomplished a great deal, and it's a particular critique. But from the standpoint of what you and I are talking about, the Communist Manifesto and that socialist critique, it doesn't really matter whether it's the Communist Manifesto or Milton Friedman in terms of this question that we're addressing, in terms of the fact that they are all unitary. They're not binary economic things. They're all based upon this labor theory of value.
That's right.
And I had suggested to them that they might want to see or look for another book. Where can we show it? Here? We can show it here, I guess. This one is called, perhaps it wasn't known, this is called The Capitalist Manifesto. In answer to, some people think it's an unfortunate name, but perhaps not so, but it's The Capitalist Manifesto that was written by the eminent, perhaps Bill Moyer said, our leading philosopher, Mortimer Adler, and who saw this issue, and more to the point, Louis Kelso.
Yes.
And that they might want to read the first 2 chapters of the Capitalist Manifesto in order to get a real alternative to the labor theory of value, one form of which is Marxism and that whole socialist thing, the other form being Mr. Friedman and things that run things now. This is radical in terms of understanding possibilities for a real change, more so than the Communist Manifesto.
This book, first of all, it's online.
It's online now, although it's probably out of print, and there's only about 6 copies around.
Yes, and this is quite valuable. It's online. I think you go to the Kelso Institute. Probably find it for you. This title is most unfortunate because if you take the connotations of capitalism, they are of narrow capital ownership, of
well, more or less what we have now.
Well, what we have
Friedman
now.
more or less in the driver's seat with Mr. Greenspan, and he was through Ayn Rand and so forth, and the limitations.
That's right.
We more or less have a laissez-faire philosophy. Mr. Clinton said it's the end of big government. We put the women off welfare so they could go out and get a work and all this sort of thing we've been going through. So the extreme right wing is sort of running the show now of that linear dimension between laissez-faire and communism at one end. They're running it now more or less now. But this book is outside of that.
Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler were in a bit of a bind or a difficulty because they wrote this book, I think, in about 1959.
58, I think.
58,
yeah.
And at that time, the Cold War was absolutely peaking.
Yeah, we had McCarthy.
And anybody who wanted to raise any new idea was labelled by the commies as extreme catalysts. This book has been described as something up the dead end of extreme capitalism by the communists, and indeed the capitalists then described this book as a work of communism. And that's because none of them could understand that when you actually propose that everybody has dignity and everybody has an economic base, that this is something totally new, and it cannot even be conceived of in left-wing economics or right-wing economics. In left-wing economics, 5 or 10% control all the capital assets.
Say in the Soviet Union, they control all the nomenklatura.
And then under right-wing economics, 5 or 10% actually own.
In the United States, 5 or 10%.
Substantial amounts. A lot of people own 40 to 45%, now own a tiny amounts, paying out very little. And they then feel that they have some sort of relationship to the share-owning structure.
Yeah, but
it's minimal amounts, and it's actually...
So it's really essentially a plutocracy.
It is
and the people that have that ownership have all the advantages. As a saying, I think Hemingway and so forth, you say the saying, it takes money to make money. The more money you have, the more you have to put up as collateral against investment in plant and equipment that's going to pay for itself out of its future earnings. And you can make that investment, gain more assets, you pay for them out of the future earnings, and because you can put up the collateral to do it, you get in that position, so the pond becomes bigger. So now if 3 individuals, I think, 3 individuals, Mr. Gate and Buffett or something, equal to half the population of the country, something on that order? Yeah, like 3 individuals, the wealth of 3 individuals, because the advantages to those that have are so immense that there's no avoiding that.
Well, this book, it's a very humane book, and Mortimer Adler's particular contribution was to give the philosophical and not quite religious, but the natural right understanding of everybody's right to own capital. And I recommend that. I mean, you won't get hold of the original copy now, but go online for it.
It may come back.
It may come back. Because it is an inspiring work. Now, going back to that young man who you say was going to Washington for the end of this month.
The 29th. They're going to be protesting.
He, alas, I suspect, I don't know, I'm open to correction, but he, alas, can say, all right, 3 cheers for the Communist Manifesto, but how it's actually been implemented, were situations where there was not a high standard of living, where heavily authoritarian, and it then became completely corrupt. And as for the environmental implications, the results of communism, completely and utterly disastrous. The idea of justice, Harold, still floats free on the left wing, and I take my hat off.
Yeah.
But then you have to have more than the idea of justice. You have to have something that actually works in practice. And going back to ideas which in practice were discredited and were disastrous in practice. I'm afraid these were the communist states, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia. Somehow we've got to go forward. I don't think it's viable to go back.
Well, the question becomes one in a certain sense. We thought, remember, it's kind of interesting to me that the CIA and our intelligence forces, and back to this issue of the bombing and that sort of thing, we've spent something over $40 billion in intelligence capability to try to gather attention to what the people are thinking in the world, and that was going on in our system of intelligence in the world. And they were talking about Ivan's talking to Boss, or this guy's talking to that, or Chan's talking to something. They were doing all this kind of tracking of what was going on and so forth, and then they missed. They did not predict. They were caught unawares by the implosion of the Soviet Union. Our intelligence services were caught unaware when the Soviet Union fell apart. Biggest thing that was happening in the last decade or two, they missed it. Yes. They missed that story. So now we've got this thing going on now, and there may have been other events that are going on in terms of the evolution of events, let's say, that have been missed by, let's say, our intelligence officers, or more importantly, perhaps, by the intellectual community itself in terms of what is going on, in terms of the evolution of events in this planet.
I think you've got you have had a smug, a complacent, self-satisfied...
A complacency and an acceptance of a status quo that is in place.
That is in place, and it is meant that people have not understood the realities of the mass of people's lives out there in the world. And the present belief is, if we carry on as we are, everything will be, is it bound to work out well in the end?
Well, that's the attitude of status quo people generally, and
it is the attitude of the haves. I'm afraid you now have to look at the problem of the have-nots.
Well, it may have been that this event downtown here is going to shake us to begin to try and look at things other than just accepting it, accepting things as the way they are. And we've been talking about economics in a certain sense. One of the things that it seems to me is that if you look at things philosophically or from an ontologic or from a sense of reality, it may be that on the one hand we have somebody as eminent as Dr. Joshua Lederberg and others who are telling us that we've arrived at this moment in the evolution of events. So here we are, 65, we've got a planet, we got the system evolving, we got millions of years of evolution, we had a comet come and hit 65 million years ago and made way for the mammalians from the dinosaurs who did it. We've had Australopithecine from a few million years ago. We had Homo habilis, and then 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens sapien appeared. About 200,000 years ago, the DNA research tells us now. We get to that point, and now we've arrived within the last 10 years or so. Yes. Where you and I are talking, we've arrived at a point with the extended capability that our consciousness has given us, the technology, we've arrived at a point, unlike any of the other species, we've arrived at a point where we do now hold the Promethean capability of destroying ourselves, and we seem ready to move into a pattern of confrontation that very well might lead to that potentiality that the destructive capability will be unleashed and destroy, and entropy and join entropy in universe. It's an existential moment of amazing import. On the other hand, what might be the averse side of that? One of the things is that if we have this destructive capability, we also have an incredible technologically augmented capability of providing what Buckminster Fuller, who was one of our leading intellectual, comprehensive people that have that we have an intellectual, augmented technological capability of providing life support for the world population as it grows, and that we were gaining on that, and that we might actually be transcending in these times the iron-clawed laws of scarcity itself as an ontologic reality. The reality has changed. We were in scarcity for 200,000 years. We are transcending that. And the intellectual community, you don't expect the political community except to drag behind, but even the intellectual community hasn't begun to, in any of our journals, address the fact that the ontologic reality of transcending scarcity is a true and measurable thing that ought to be studied in terms of having a basis by which we might inform our political, industrial, and otherwise leadership. It's been a failure of the intellectual community to grasp that as a possibility because it's so terribly inconvenient to all the organizing assumptions that we've built up over 200,000 years of human evolution.
There's a richer cast of mind, and I've already touched on one which I think opens up the thinking, which is the question of who or what actually does the work. But there is a second one, Harold, and a little while ago I came across a document which actually involves you, and it was you and things you were doing about 30 years ago.
Oh, well, yeah.
And if you go back to that period when you were, is it New Paltz? Was
yeah,
it
New Paltz. Yeah, I was a professor upstate at a university in New Paltz, New York. Yeah.
But what was coming through, what you were saying at the time in the article I read, was this understanding that we had, at that particular point in time, had achieved a capacity and an ability to solve poverty. It doesn't mean to say in the particular lives of these particular individuals or this society that the problem was being solved, but it was potentially capable. Now, you raised that issue and you must have walked into a lot of trouble because that goes straight against what was the major aspect of thinking then and is still the major aspect of thinking today.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
which is that scarcity is inevitable and that there's only going to be so much, and frankly that some of us grab it and are able to get on, and it's too bad for the rest.
That is the accepted realistic reality that they will use to talk about the ontological, the reality, and also by deflection or by inflection or by assumption, notions of human nature and other notions that we have in terms of the way in which we structure social policy and so forth. So the idea, because if that, and that was Buckminster Fuller, I don't know who we have that has really been comprehensively taking the measure of what's going on and realizing the implications of the technological extensions of our consciousness more responsibly than he. There are a number of people who tried to pick up on him. Norman Cousins, a great deal of the intellectual community tried to pick up on the leadership that he provided, but outside of the questions of understanding of cosmology and universal evolution of universal consciousness, that sort of thing, but at the level of geopolitical or economic reality was this idea that he did. I have a thing, maybe I have a chart, maybe we could do it. One of the cameras could pick up, and I think it might be worth mentioning. There's a chart that was his, and he put it out in a book, and this is worth, he took the notion, Fuller did, let me show it here, if you would hold that please. This is a chart, maybe you can come in tight on this. This is a thing from Buckminster Fuller, the great comprehensive intellectual force that I would suggest ought to be picked up again. And what this chart is a measurement, a rough measurement through time of the have-nots and the haves as he measured. He had a coefficiency of have-ness and that sort of thing. And his projection was that through time, that throughout the vast majority of the time, we were probably, in measure, he had coefficiencies of energy slave availabilities, other ways of measuring this question of have and have not. Who is a have and who is a have not? A different way. The arguments about that could be that you cannot only all be haves unless everybody's swimming in a swimming pool, diamonds, or some sort of theory. You have to get at that. But he had a measurement of that. And he said that through time we got to the point, we get the steam engine, so that brought tremendous capability of providing life support for greater numbers of people than had been the case before. And he said by the First World War, which is down here, and this is a whole system scale, that he was seeing things, the whole world population, we had reached a point where in his reckoning, something like 10% of the world population could realistically have been seen at that time to be haves in terms of our abstract technological augmented capability to provide life support. His reckoning was that by the time we got to the Second World War, We had reached a point where the collective technological capability, there was about 20% of the world population could be seen to be haves. It was accelerating. It was accelerating in this modern period. Then he wrote in 1952, this particular chart was copyrighted in 1952. He said we reached about 30%, and he claimed that we had a 20-year imminent crisis to all human institutions as we approached and crossed the 50% mark that he projected would be about in the year 1970. And he made provision that the pace of technological development and capability might be advanced faster than that. And in fact, he came to the conclusion that we crossed that line where 50% of the world population could be seen in realistic terms to be haves, as opposed to there would be more haves than have-nots on a realistic scale in terms of a technologically augmented capability of providing life support. And that's what the 60s was about. That's what Bobby Dylan was singing about. He was realizing this transformation. It wasn't just Vietnam. It wasn't just women's rights or some of these things out of history. We were going through a tremendous we were transcending scarcity as an ontologic reality, and that process has only accelerated. This is a chart that should be on every wall of every intellectual think tank in all of the world, and this should be the major project that should be on the agendas of all our think tank and intellectual think. Is this true? Can this be true?
Just think
that
about
we have the ability to provide for everybody, so that we do not have the assumptions of scarcity as an ontologic reality? There should be a Manhattan Project on this issue, and it is totally ignored, and it's only accepted that obviously there's never enough, there's not enough, we must fight over in a zero-sum scale kind of way. But this is the reality that is blowing in the wind, and that the opposition to the way things are, which are so easily accepted, is something that should be done. We've run out of time for this. We have another segment. So we're talking with Rodney Shakespeare. We'll have another return coming up next week, but that's it for now. Rodney, thanks for coming in. We thank you for viewing, and we'll be coming back with more of this next week. So please tune in next week, and we're talking with Rodney Shakespeare, co-author of Binary Economics, The New Paradigm, and this is on September 26, 2001. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. And thanks for coming in now, Rodney.
What he said, hit the Buckminster Fuller aspect of
Well,
it.
that's a thing that it would, if it were able to, it would subsume so many of the other things.
Yes.
If that's true.
If it's true, yes.
Yeah. Now, and how does one measure it, or how does one, on the whole, everyone just simply says that's impossible. And that's the general accepted notion of the reality, the ontology.
But I think that you can't explain the globalization protesters unless you can say, well, why is it they think they can do something? Most of them haven't got a clear idea of what to do.
Well, that's right.
But I suspect they do sense.
I think it's at a sense level.